Welcome to my podcast, Why Didn't Anyone Tell Me This? With my guests, we are discussing health issues, questions you may have, and debunking some of the myths around our health. And it's a total pleasure today to be talking to Laura Spoelstra about mental health, more than just a buzzword. Laura and I have known each other for many years, and Laura has many amazing achievements. But today we're going to talk about mental health, which is a topic I've not yet discussed on my podcast, so it's long overdue. Welcome, Laura.
Hi, Joyce. It's great to be here.
So, Laura has been involved in the fertility sector as an expert in donation issues for almost 15 years. And during that time, she was involved in various national policy working parties, including the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority, the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, and the Joint Committee on the Human Tissue and Embryos Bill. But more recently, she's been focusing on well-being of young people and mental health. And she's been a listening volunteer for Samaritans, a national organisation providing emotional support to anyone in emotional distress, struggling to cope or at risk of suicide. Laura is a Samaritans branch deputy director, a regional officer, and a qualified mental health first aider. So, first, Laura, before we get into the mental health in detail, I would love for you to tell us more about your journey and what's led you to work for the Samaritans.
Yeah, sure. Well, when I worked in the fertility sector, that's where I met you many years ago. My drive to do that was to help people. I was an egg donor, then I became head of the organization about egg donation. When I left the sector 8 years ago, um, fairly dissatisfied, I realized I still had this desire and need to support people. Now, I always had an interest in mental health. I always had an interest in people, what makes them tick, and why do they do things, and how can I make it better for them. Um, and I've always been everybody's egg in the arm. They always asked me for advice, rightly or wrongly, they just did. And there was a time that somebody very near to me contacted me in the middle of the night. That person had just lost somebody, and he rang me and said, I want to be with John. And I freaked because I realized, I thought what they said, I want to die as well. And I realized at that moment I wasn't able to support somebody who was very near to me. And I referred him to Samaritans and realized later on, actually, I want to know more about Samaritans and I want to be able to have the really difficult discussions. I contacted them and went through long training, and here I am, fully fledged for many years now, a Samaritans volunteer. And through the other work that I do with them, which is the regional officer, and I'm dealing with the data, I typically look at the background. Why do people call us? What are they like that people are calling us? And that's where my interest in mental health, but I dare say my knowledge on the mental health issues, not on a medical level, but on a, I guess, statistical level. Where does it come from?
Wow. So it's I know it's a really hard job, and I think we'll get into that. But let's start with the basics,
Mm.
as we often talk about mental health. But what does it actually mean? What is mental health?
Mental health is, in the sense, the same as physical health. It's intrinsic to who we are, and it's our ability to cope with life, its ups and downs. It's our ability to deal with social life, psychological life, our well-being. It's different from having good mental health. Is different from not having a mental disorder. And mental health is not a static thing. It changes over. It changes on a day with some people, and it changes during your lifetime. So you could feel depressed, and there's this, let's say, skill from depressed to thriving, but there's a whole thing in between: depressed, struggling, enduring, managing, succeeding, and thriving. Mental health is the reason why this is called mental health, is more than just a buzzword. It's it is very important. It's a third of illnesses is caused by bad mental health. Because it impacts our emotional, psychological, and social well-being, it is crucial that we get that right. And because and I know we get into that later, because the mental state of the world has absolutely declined in recent years. It has to become a priority of all the governments to get that right.
I do totally agree. And you and I are both getting on. We were talking about this before we came on. I'm over 60. Laura's almost over 60, or
Yeah,
approaching
my grey
60.
hair are traces different.
I love your grey hair; it looks gorgeous. But I think at our age, we do become a bit wise, and we've realised that. And I wrote a lot about this in my last book, and it's going to be a major part of my next book. That we need to look after our well-being, and it is our
Mm,
nutrition, our exercise, and our sleep, which very much affect our physical health, but they all also affect, which I would say point four is our mental health is so important to our well-being, and as you said, our physical and mental health are totally wrapped up together. And I wish more younger people understood this. I think as you said, governments need to be ingraining this. And yesterday we did an event at the House of
mm,
Commons about the next government. How are they going to look after specifically women's health? And mental health came up a lot. It is intrinsic for our
yeah.
health to look after that. So how does mental health affect people's quality of life?
Mental health is everywhere. And I'm glad you started off this saying about when we are at this age, we've had experience, and that experience gives us the resilience. And the problem with, or the challenge for younger people is they haven't built that resilience muscle just yet. Once you reach a certain age, you know that this too will pass, and we know that life is inherently cyclic, and we develop the tools to deal with that. And if you haven't got these tools, everything becomes a problem. And one of the challenges, and we see that with Samaritans as well, we elder people, we listen to younger people, and there is this, gosh, they haven't got a backbone or anything else. But the problem with younger people is certainly the ones who, the 18 to 24 slide now, is they have been hugely impacted by COVID. When we grew up, Joyce, with all due respect, our our lives was our neighbors, our friends, our parents' friends, our school. That was it. We didn't have social media. We didn't have the first thing you do. And now you know exactly what's happening across the globe. And not only that, you know something about it, you have to have an opinion about it. So what happens is that for young people, they the world is too near, and that has all sorts of other issues, and I can get into that a bit later. But social we are inherently social beings, and if our mental health is impacted, it impacts our mood and our outlook on life. It impacts our social self. It impacts our drive and motivation. It's how our resilience, as I said, is how we cope with stuff. And if that's not going the way it should be going, it means that we might have problems building relationships either with friends, family, partners. We might not be able to focus at school. We might not, or at work. We cannot hold a train of thought. We for everything that happens to us, we think it's a disaster because, well, that could be the way people are thinking. Because again, with mental health, people respond in different ways. Um, for some people, it's typical the cup half full or half empty. That too. I mean, but when you're younger, you look at it half full, half empty. Whilst we're older, we know the point is the cup is refillable, and that is something. So if you haven't got that resilience, if you can't build relationship, if you catastrophize everything, it makes life incredibly difficult. And I only recently, as recent as last week, the statistic came out when they measured the mental health of women in Europe, and 30%, 32% actually, of British women were stressed, which is a ridiculously high number, and that and it impacts on everything. And that again goes about relationships and work and everything else. So it impacts on absolutely every single level. And it impacts literally from child to 95. It impacts everybody, and the ability to cope with it is the most important thing.
I agree that when we grew up, life was very simple. You know, as you said about our friendship
Mm.
groups and how we lived our life, and now life is it's we're bombarded with information, data, as you said, what's going on around the whole world, and it has such an impact. When I did the podcast about sleep with Neil Stanley, he was saying that, you know, he doesn't think that we sleep worse than we did, but we are bombarded during the day now with so much more information compared to 20, 30, 40 years ago, that it may well have an effect on how we sleep, and absolutely have an effect on our mental health. So 32% of women feeling that they
Mm.
are stressed, you know, we have a much more stressed environment. And this wasn't helped by COVID. You just mentioned COVID. So many people
Yeah.
suffered with mental health issues during COVID. Can you tell us more about? And I think we're still seeing that ripple effect. How did COVID impact people's mental health?
The challenge with mental health is that in itself it's self-reported, so you can't do a blood test on how is somebody suffering. It's no open wound, so inherently it's self-reporting. So you can only go by how people feel. Having said that, there was already a decline in mental health globally before COVID, but during COVID, it's been estimated that 25% worse, which is already it's already a ridiculously bad statistic. But now it is, you know, 1 in 8 people globally will have a mental health issue during their lifetime. In the UK, it's 1 in 4. And I can go in about the difference later on, but 1 in 4 people in a lifetime will have mental health issues. The group biggest impactors are the young people, not surprisingly. Now, what we thought was going to happen as soon as the world would recalibrate in 2022, it would go back, but it hasn't. It hasn't, and especially for younger people. The worrying bit is that the impact COVID had on mental health for young people actually declined even further. So the reset didn't happen. The over 65s did well, stayed steady mental health wise, and but it's impacted the world, and we're not there yet, and we're not sure whether we'll ever be at the old levels, which were bad at the best of times. Don't get me wrong; it wasn't rosy before the time. Since the 1990s, the numbers have really dived, and they continue to dive.
Yeah, it's one of my friends' partners, a paramedic, and he said that during COVID, well, especially during the lockdown, when he was having to go to houses, especially around suicide, which we'll come back to in a moment, you know, he attempted suicide in
Mm.
young people was, you know, and how they were trying to do it. He said it was just you. He said you wouldn't have believed how people were being affected by that. Let's go a little bit more into the different challenges through the life course. So you talked about young people. So how is always mental health different at different stages of our lives?
Yeah. Well, when you're younger, in the age when your brain and everything else develops, and your experience of relationships, either with your parents, that has a huge impact. Parenting, harsh parenting, has an impact on mental health, and again, in relationships, and of course, health. And what they know now is that the about 25% of people with mental health issues that's developed before they were 24. No, actually, no, it's actually much higher than that. Sorry, it's much higher than that. Which means that if you deal with that from a younger age, you might be able to cope later on in life. What we've seen in between the years 2017 to 2022 is that between young people between 7 and 16, whilst initially it was 1 in 8 would suffer from mental health issues, it was by 2022 is 1 in 6, and the group 17 to 19 was 1 in 4, which 24% of 17 to 19-year-olds have mental health issues. Now, mental health is a big term, and it covers things like anxiety, depression, bipolar, schizophrenia, PTSD, eating disorders, and then of course you've got the clinical depression, which is altogether not completely different things, but within the depression range you have got really severe clinical depression, which means that no matter what happens in your life, it's dark and bleak. Um, but something like anxiety, about 40% of people suffer from anxiety or have episodes of anxiety. In itself, it's highly treatable, but only 40% of that seek treatment, which is a shame, because it is something people do not have to suffer with. Um, but the group biggest impacted are the young people. Having said all that, and this links to the suicide, the highest suicide rate is between 50 and 54. Many more suicide attempts before that time, but suicide rate is highest in people between 50 and 54. So there's, well, actually, technically, that's not true. The highest suicide rate is in people over 94, but there's such a small group. Um, you could say that high percentage of 94-year-olds, but there are not that many 94-year-olds. But people, as they get older, they get, looks like, more depressed.
Well, is there a difference between men and women with their mental health issues?
Well, mental health issues or suicide? Yes, there is. Women are more likely to report depression, and women are more likely to seek treatment for depression by 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 male. However, and this is an absolutely shocking statistic. I know that with my Samaritan's experience, but men are 3 times more likely to die by suicide. If you look at the numbers, there are 3 times as many men who die by suicide than women. It looks like 74% and 26, which is ridiculous. And again, in the 50 to 54 bracket. Although with men it's 25 to 65 is the biggest group, but yeah, 75% of reported suicides in the UK and typically globally are men. And the reason why there's a difference, because people ask that, is because again, it's more the women who report suicide. Of course, the nature of suicide is you can't really ask what made you do it, sadly. But one of the reasons is that men do not seek help in the same way that women do. Men do not talk about it in the same way that women do. And not unimportantly, is that the methods men use are typically more violent than women use. Because women also have much more suicide attempts. And it seems that the attempts of the men are just, well, more violent and therefore result in suicide.
I didn't think about that. Yeah, so there's more suicide attempts in women, but the men, when they do it,
Yeah.
they do it. And for men, I believe that it's higher at every single age. Is that right?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
It's across whatever age group. It's more men than women. Yeah.
And there has been quite a bit
By
in the
far.
press. Yeah, there has been quite a bit in the press recently about women around the menopause and suicide, and a lot of debate and discussion around this. Have you come across any issues with women and their mental health and the increased risk of suicide around menopause?
Well, the age group with the women is 50 to 54, which suggests it's menopausal age, but I wouldn't know whether it's actually directly linked to menopause. However, with women and stress, or what we know about why people take their own lives, it could be, um, I say disability not as being disabled, by lack of ability cognitive issues, lack of self-worth, just a general mood, all sorts of things that impact women both in menopause and in situations of stress. So I don't know enough about the actual menopause symptoms, so to speak, to say it's directly linked, but the age group suggests that there is some sort of link.
Yeah, it's a very understudied area, to be honest, and
Yeah.
even the definitions of mental health problems as symptoms of menopause is really not well studied. So there have been some people suggest that,
I guess both in men and women at that age, and having gone through that age as well, there might be something. Is this all there is, or questioning your life choices, bleaker outlook, um, our sense of self, and our sense of confidence, which takes a nosedive during menopause. They're all linked. But suicide and mental health is not a one thing. It's always there could be so many different issues with so many different people, and it's hardly ever just one element that makes people feel the way they do. It's a combination of.
so you've already mentioned that there are things that people can do. So if people are suffering from mental health issues, they shouldn't. I think we would agree that they shouldn't suffer in silence. They should go and seek medical help. So what can be done to improve different types of mental health?
You said medical help. It's not necessarily medical. The problem also with the word self-help is that it makes people believe that they have to do everything themselves. Not necessarily. Is plenty of help available. Well, not with the NHS nowadays. There is help, but you might end up on a waiting list. Let's be honest. But there is something that can be done. I guess for yourself is talking about it. It's making people realize that they're not alone. They shouldn't be alone, and it's reaching out to their friends or organizations like Samaritans or their GP, and take it from there. The obvious ones, and I know that it's Mental Health Week uh, this month. It's Mental Health Month actually, May, and the theme of this year is movement, and it's to move. It's to go out and move, not just it's not about running a marathon. It is about even going outside and go for a 5 minute walk. If you can't do 10, do 5. It's putting some music on and dance, jump around, do whatever. It is good nutrition, obviously. One of the reasons why the UK fares so badly on the international mental health um, list, there's a list, believe it or not, is because of the higher use of ultra processed food. There is an absolute direct link between eating the sugars and the ultra processed food and mental health. Having said all that, it's easier said than done. It's all great and good to say to people, well, you can impact your mental health by doing this, this, and the other. But the one thing people shouldn't do is beat themselves up over it. There are things you can do, but it doesn't mean you have to do it on your own. And there is help out there. And be realistic about what you can do. Seeking your GP is probably one of the first things, but it's, I think, realizing that many of these, what people suffer from, can be treated. Again, as I said before, there is clinical depression, which typically takes medication or therapy, and part of that could be talking therapy. And people have to realize there's a difference between having bipolar disorder or having anxiety. But so it depends what you're dealing with, what help you should be looking for. But there's lots that can be done yourself.
When I talk about the pillars of well-being, I always start with nutrition, exercise or movement, sleep, and then I say mental health, and I say the first three all feed into our mental health. So if we're not sorting out all of them, they will all affect each other. And
Yeah.
my dear friend Alice Mukherjee has written, it is a menopause book, but she has this great analogy where she says It's like having a house with all the windows open. If you just shut one of them, you might slightly improve. But really, for our well-being, we need to shut all of them. So we need to sort all of these out. As you said, they do all feed into each other. And I was at a
Yeah.
conference.
I forgot the
Oh,
most
yeah,
important one actually.
yeah.
I forgot what probably two of the most important ones. One of them is social connection. It's
Mm.
other people. But the problem with people who are anxious and having feel depressed is that the first thing they do is lock themselves up, which is actually one of the worst things you can do, because it's best to connect with other people. And it links in with the other thing, which you should do, is your social media. So on one level, we are more connected than ever, but at the same time, we are disconnected from real people. And all the while, social media comes in, feeding you with comparison, other people's joy, and we all know the comparison kills every joy because you think you're doing okay, or you think, and then you see somebody else doing 10 times, or you think they do 10 times better. So it's cut off social media and actually focus on real connections. You don't have to have 20 friends, but one person you can talk to, or one person you can share some stuff with. There's a very good campaign. And I urge people to look at that on YouTube. It's literally Norwich football suicide. It's a fantastic short clip about this is a man who is suffer from depression. But what is so I know that it's done to make people to highlight that it's never the person you think it is who might be suffering from uh, depression. But I looked at it differently and thought, isn't it interesting that despite the fact that all the time they talk, or they no, all the time they spend together, they never actually talk. They never actually say, you know, if somebody asks how are you feeling, they say okay or bad. Now, okay and bad are not emotions; they're just labels. But they actually ever say, actually, I'm feeling whatever it is, undervalued, not respected, not loved, unhappy, whatever. They don't do that. So connecting with other people is absolutely key to better mental health as well.
You're totally right, because in my last book I'd written about the four pillars of well-being, which as I said, the nutrition and exercise, sleep, and mental health. But I had forgotten. I don't know how I'd forgotten. I'm a very social person. I'd forgotten about the social connections, and it was watching the Blue Zones documentary series that talked about the places in the world with great longevity, and their social connections are really, really important. So I think those five things all do fill in together. And I was at a conference a couple of years ago, and someone was an expert on happiness. And there was a question at the end where they were asked, if you have a friend who's struggling and who's not feeling happy, what would you advise them? And the speaker said, "Oh, that's a tricky question. I don't have an answer." Whereas I was sort of screaming in the background saying, "I tell them, as you said, to get outside, do some movement, ideally with some friends, even one friend. So going for a
Yeah.
walk. I mean, today's a beautiful day, so going for a walk in outside, even if it's not a beautiful day, going for a walk outside, you're moving, you're outside, you're getting in those blue and green zones, and you've got your social connection even with one person. I think that is such a great way to improve your mental health. So it was great that you said that as well. If someone's doing those things, you've mentioned that there are some really chronic diseases and chronic depression,
Mm.
etc. Has the um, treatment that doctors can give now, has that improved? Are there more options for people to try and improve their mental health in other ways?
Well, there are more treatment options, there are more medication, we know more about the treatment, but at the same time, mental health issues have increased, so we're still on the same bad level. Um, Medication works in some cases, but we also know that people can over medicate. They go And part of that is the lack of time that is being spent on patients. People say I'm depressed, and rather than actually looking at the root, why is that? People do not wake up depressed. It's a combination of no relationships, poverty, disability, inequality, lack of. So, but rather than taking the time and looking at the root causes, they describe a pill, and that's it. So it doesn't deal with the root cause. So probably as soon as you off the pills or the medication, the problem hasn't resolved. So medication, but there are the more clinical, like bipolar, schizophrenia, PTSD to some extent, severe depression. Many of them do require, in combination of all the other things, including therapy, includes require medication. But there are plenty of, like anxiety on the lower scale, which impacts a lot of people, doesn't necessarily require medication. So it really depends on the case, and it depends on the person, because some people are not happy taking medication either. They say, I've known bipolar people who refuse to take lithium. They said, so it numbs me.
Mm.
And yeah, it depends on the person.
Yeah, for sure. But there are options out there, so people should
Yes.
not suffer. I always say we shouldn't be suffering in silence. Which brings me on to the Samaritans. Tell us more about the Samaritans and your work there.
So Samaritans are a national organization, and it deals with people who are in a dark place, typically suicidal thoughts, open 24/7, mainly via phone calls or web chat. And what it means that we have a couple of thousand, 22,000 people, Samaritans in the UK, who at least once a week spend a couple of hours being on the phone. What that means, we're very well trained. It takes about a year of weekly training before you're actually on your own on the phone, because somebody calls Samaritans expressing their darkest thought, and typically because it is confidential, um, you do, and if they call Samaritans, we generally pick up the phone. We don't see any number or anything. We know nothing about the person other than what they tell us. And many, I've had in-depth conversations with somebody. All I knew is that they were a woman, and I could guess their age, but that's all you know about it. Yet, what that does is that people tell you absolutely everything. The main objective of Samaritans is reduce the number of people who take their life. That's it. It's very simple. That's not because if somebody calls and expresses suicidal, they never call and say, or hardly ever, I'm suicidal. We don't say, oh, don't do it. That's not how it works. We are there to listen to them. We're there to listen. We don't give advice because we don't know the person. But by good questions and by just being there for that person, we try to help them through that moment. And sometimes we can, sometimes we can't. But it's one of the is one of the main, even the NHS refers to Samaritans, everybody refers to Samaritans. It's one of these organisations that certainly nowadays the country seems to rely on. So, and what I do, I'm a volunteer. I have been for many years within our branch. We're the third largest branch of the UK. I'm deputy director, and regionally in the southeast, I'm what we call the number cruncher. The official title is Regional Capacity Improvement Officer. I have to think for a second. So my job is to make sure that we can cope with the number of calls we get, which is relentless. Every 10 seconds, somebody calls, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And that's an indication of how people in the country feel, which is not in a good state. They've got nobody else to talk to, or they want to talk to somebody in confidence.
That's worrying statistics. Has the number of phone calls increased over the years? Are there certain times of the day or season or wherever where there's more demand?
Yeah. It has increased, and certainly, for instance, over COVID, it changed because people didn't want to, because everybody was in the same house, so they didn't want to call. So that's why web chat became very important. As is to be expected, the phone calls during the night are the worst because people have got nobody else to turn to, and other bodies, like for instance the NHS or Mind or other charities dealing with people with mental health issues, typically shut in the evening, and we're the only ones who are open 24/7. So middle of the night are the tough ones, between 2 and 3 at night. That's when people call, and the suicide calls, there's three times as likely to have suicide calls at night, overnight, than during the day. Yeah.
So I have friends who are mental health nurses as well, and I've asked them the same question. How do you cope with answering those phone calls and talking to people who are so distressed? How do you cope after a day answering the phones? Is there someone to then support you?
Yes. Well, for a start, we're not on the phone for a day. We have 3 hour shifts, some branches different hours. It's a tricky one because on one hand you need to care enough about people that you go through the training and are prepared to step in your car 1 o'clock at night to do calls at 2 o'clock to 5 o'clock for people. But at the same time, you shouldn't care so much that you, after sometimes immensely distressing calls, you worry about the person because there's nothing you can do about you, nothing about the person. There is a very good support system within Samaritans itself. After every shift, you have to debrief to a leader how the calls impact on you. You have the other Samaritan you need to talk to, and the mental health of the Samaritan is of course paramount because we need to be steady. And there are some calls which are, well, quite a few can be pretty horrible, and that's the nature of Samaritans. And it could be different calls are difficult for different people. My Achilles heel are young people because, or typically young people in the same age as my children, because then of course it hits me, and I try not to have my own narrative running sort of how would I cope if my child was like this, and you don't. You get trained not to think about your own stuff, but inherently you do sometimes. And for other people, if they've lost somebody who calls to say that they've just been bereaved, could be their Achilles heel. But we're very well supported and very well trained, but it never gets easier.
Yeah, I can imagine that's really tough. So I've called this podcast "Why Didn't Anyone Tell Me This?" because I've heard in my career so many people that weren't aware of something. So for mental health, are there things that you have heard people say, "Why didn't I know this before?" Or is there something you would really want people to know about their mental health that you wished everyone should know?
I wish that people would take their mental health seriously and treat it as serious as how they maintain their car, how they maintain everything in life, and how they maintain their body. If they do, I wish people realize that the way they think has a huge impact on the way they talk, think, um, act, and has a huge impact on your physical health. It is, stress and everything else is absolutely directly linked to other health issues, physical health issues. I wish people would realize that and take it very seriously. I wish people would realize they were not on their own. There are many people out there suffering, and therefore there is help. And it's about seeking the right help, which could be Samaritans, could be your GP, or could be talking to somebody you trust. Of course, I would say I wish people knew that they could call Samaritans at any time of the day, and we are there to help as well. But there are other organizations like Samaritans. But I think the main thing is that I wish that people realize just how important it is to maintain their mental health, and keep looking after themselves.
Yeah, I think our physical health is so much more obvious that I totally agree that people have put mental health at the end, and that they really need to look after that, and
Yeah,
it's so important.
they are. I mean, COVID was the pandemic which killed millions of people, but stress and everything else is been actually a bigger pandemic, and that indirectly kills people too, not just by suicide, but also by the impact on physical health. And that's a much greater worry for long term for the world than anything else. I wish people would realize that.
And I know it's hard if you're at home and you're depressed and you're feeling lonely to think, to motivate yourself to get up and go outside and have a walk. But I think we both wish that more people would do that and try
Yeah,
and scoop themselves up. And
absolutely. Yeah, yeah. And the thing is, what is women tend to do things differently. I'd call a friend who would go out and we sit together and we talk about it, and then men doing differently. And I think with men, if they do something and they're not facing each other, but sitting next to each other, and it could be watching sport or anything else, at least they don't have, as part of what they do, whether that is playing golf or fishing or going to football or anything else, or when you put your kids, you put your kids in the back of the car, that's when the discussions happen, when you don't sit next to, confronting each other. And people should normalize asking, how are you doing? And then asking the second question, and how are you really doing? Um, that's really key to it. It doesn't mean that you have to go to a therapist. There are people around you who are probably willing to help by just talking. It doesn't have to be in an organized setting. And
yeah,
I think the other important this is not just what you do to yourself or what you do to people around you. So if you worry about somebody and they say, how are you doing? Yeah, okay. How are you really doing? But just asking the next question, how are you really doing? And that allows the conversation to happen between both of you, which could be helpful to both of you.
yeah. It is often, I think, quite difficult to know when someone's really feeling very, very depressed. I think a lot of them hide it, and certainly
Mm.
suicidal. I've been told that it's often not the people you thought someone was okay, and they're not. But let's all be nice to each other. And let's try and with our circle of friends and family make sure we check in with each other and
Yeah.
take people out for a walk. um, Laura, on the last few questions that I ask all my guests, which is a very big turnaround in this podcast more than any of the others, is about what makes you happy and where is your happy place? Because I think, well, I know from asking my guests and also from my research for my next book, what makes people happy is very, very different. Everyone's got a totally different answer. So I'd like to hear from you. What makes you happy and where is your happy place?
I am such a simple person because if you look at stats, what makes people happy and how I can prove their happiness is typically on number one, which is express gratitude. My happiness is linked to gratitude, and that is my children. I'm just always grateful that I happen to, you know, I've got two young idols who I happen to like, and I like to hang out with my kids. So that's very simple. I've done so many things in my life, but that what makes me happiest is just being with young adults who I like to hang out with, which happens to be my kids. Wider picture, children, family, friends. I'm a social animal, so that makes me happiest. My happy place is not a specific place. It's wherever I am with number one, which is my children, my family, or my friends.
I think that's great because some people have told me things that are sort of quite unobtainable on a daily basis. So they'll say something like, a particular holiday destination or something which they can only get to sort of once a year. So it's good to have things that
Yeah,
are
well, that's exactly I said before, is being realistic what you can do. Expressing gratitude of because no matter what we feel and how bad we think we've got it, that's another good thing about being a Samaritan. After every shift, I think, wow, am I grateful that I'm on this side of the phone and not the other side, and I'm grateful for what I have, and I'm grateful for whatever I just heard, but then in the reverse. Not that my life is perfect, far from it, but there are always things that from a bad call I can relate to. Luckily, I haven't got that. And my pockets of happiness, it's not that my life is constantly happy. Not at all. But for me, not being happy doesn't mean the reverse, that therefore I'm unhappy. Not at all. I strive to have a life which is, 70, 80%, well, 70% content. And I have pockets of happiness. And I create these pockets of happiness, which is my whatever I'm grateful for. So it's not one thing, it's my little pockets of happiness all through the day, or sometimes not day, but week, that makes me overall pretty content, and I guess that's happiness.
Yeah, the criticism I've had about that question from only a few people have been, no one's happy all of the time. And as you said, we're not going to be happy all of the time. We all have ups and downs. We all have some stuff in our lives that, we were talking earlier, one of my sons is about to go to America, and I am a very happy person, but I have already cried several times today thinking about him going. And I obviously I'm very happy that he's going, but it also breaks my heart. So, those things in life are totally normal. Ups and downs are totally normal. So when we're thinking about mental health, I think mental health, obviously we're not going to be on cloud nine every day, every minute of every day. But when it gets too much, when it gets too much, that it's really affecting our day-to-day activities. And this is what we've been talking about, health in general. When you've got something that's affecting your quality of life and you don't feel you can function, it might be your period or a pain or your mental health, then that's where we really need to be thinking, right, I need to get some help. And so that's exactly the same with mental health.
Yeah.
And the very last question, what advice would you give your younger self?
This ties in with happiness as well, in as much that I have learned not to look at the things I would be different. I would be, let's put it this way, I think I would be unhappy if I were to punish myself or kick myself with choices I made in the past. And the advice I would give my younger self is it's not something I would do, because there's not much point to it, because I live now and my younger self is not listening anyway. If there was a lesson that I've learned versus when a younger self, is that I can't fix other people, nor should I try to. I think that's my biggest lesson. But I'm not saying I wish I knew that before, because I can't. That's my part of happiness. My happiness is accepting that what is, and I can't change. I can't change circumstances. I can only deal with what I can deal with. That's it. That's my happiness. So there, my younger self is not. I'm not even giving. What I'm saying is, I'm not giving my younger self advice because it's useless anyway. But I know what you're saying. So the lesson is, you can't fix other people, nor should you try. That's actually
Laura,
a lesson to myself now.
Yeah, Laura, it's been the heaviest podcast I've had to do, because obviously we've been talking about something that's a very, very tricky subject. But thank you so much for your words of wisdom and all the work you're doing with the Samaritans. And hopefully, if we have got anyone listening who is struggling with their mental health, we've given them the encouragement to go and talk to somebody, and to maybe find some medical help or a friend who might be able to help, and not suffer alone.
Yes, not suffer alone. It's the key message for today. Thank you for having me. It was great.
Thanks, Laura.
It might be a heavy subject, but it's not it doesn't have to be.
No, and we mustn't sweep it under the carpet. So thank you so much.